In Planet Reddit, today's story is...
My husband blamed me for not being able to have children and filed for divorce. 8 months later, I got pregnant, and he discovered something unthinkable about himself. I always thought that Greg, my husband, and I shared the same dream of starting a family. We were young, we were in love, and we imagined a future full of children's laughter, little feet running around the house, and all the wonderful craziness that comes with being a parent. During the first few years, everything seemed to be going according to plan. We were financially stable, we had just moved into a cozy house, and we started trying to have a baby. At first, everything was exciting. Calculating our cycles, taking vitamins, and fantasizing about how we would break the news to our families. But as the months turned into years, the hope that had sustained us began to become a heavy burden. After about a year of trying without success, we sought medical help. Doctor visits, blood tests, ultrasounds, and even uncomfortable conversations about Greg's reproductive health, which he became very defensive about, became part of our routine. Each appointment brought new recommendations and treatments to try. Every month we told ourselves that this would be the one, but it never was. The first few years were difficult, but we supported each other. When the test results were inconclusive, with nothing clearly wrong in my case, we clung to the idea that we just needed more time. And that's when we started fertility treatments. I remember how invasive the whole process felt. The hormone injections, the constant monitoring, and the endless array of medications left me emotionally and physically exhausted. The treatments were expensive, but Greg insisted that we couldn't put a price on building our family. I agreed because at the time, I believed we were both striving for the same dream. The first cycle of treatments failed, then the second, and then the third. Each time I saw that negative result, I felt as if I had been punched in the stomach. I blamed myself, convinced that there was something wrong with me that the doctors simply couldn't identify. Greg began to distance himself during this time, although I tried to convince myself that it was his way of dealing with the situation. He stopped accompanying me to appointments and was less enthusiastic about conversations about the next step. One night, after another failed cycle, I broke down. I was crying my heart out in the kitchen while Greg just watched me from across the room. I confessed that I didn't know how much more I could bear, and for the first time he admitted that he was exhausted too. He said he was tired of living life according to a timetable, of hoping for something that seemed impossible, and of seeing me suffer emotionally and physically for a dream that seemed unattainable. His words hurt, but I understood what he meant. I told him I was willing to take a break from treatments if that's what we needed. I still wanted to have a baby, but I didn't want my marriage to fall apart in the process. But Greg's idea of a break was different to mine. A few weeks later, he sat me down and said he couldn't go on anymore. He didn't just want a break from the treatments. He wanted a break from me, from us. He said he was tired of fighting what he called a battle we would always lose. He filed for divorce within the month. I was completely stunned. We had shared almost a decade together, and I thought we were in this as a team. How could he just walk away from everything we had built? From the life we had imagined together? He told me it wasn't just the treatments, it was everything. He said he felt like we were trapped in an endless cycle of disappointment and that he couldn't see a way out. Looking back, I think he was looking for someone to blame. He needed to hold someone responsible for his unhappiness, and I was the easiest target. In his mind, I was the one who couldn't give him what he wanted, even though the doctors had never definitively said that the problem was mine. The divorce was brutal, not only because of the emotional pain, but also because of the practical issues. We had spent tens of thousands of dollars on fertility treatments, and he made it clear that he felt it had been a waste. He didn't say it directly, but his change of attitude made it obvious that he held me responsible. After the papers were signed, I was left with only my half of the savings and a huge void in my heart. I didn't just lose my husband, I lost the future I spent years dreaming of. For months, I couldn't even look at a baby without feeling a mixture of sadness and anger. But as the months went by, I realized that I didn't miss Greg as much as I thought. The man I had married was kind, patient, and understanding, but the man I divorced was bitter and distant. I missed the version of him that no longer existed, and that realization helped me start to move on. The first year after the divorce was a whirlwind of emotions. I felt devastated, as if I had failed not only Greg, but also myself. The constant cycle of hope and disappointment of our fertility treatments had left scars that I was not sure would ever heal. I immersed myself in my career, taking on new challenges and reconnecting with passions that I had put aside during my marriage. My friends, who had taken a back seat during my years of fertility obsession, quickly welcomed me back into their lives. They became my lifeline, reminding me that I was more than the infertile woman label I had worn like a badge of shame for so long. Around 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I met Evan. He wasn't the kind of man I would normally have been interested in. While Greg had been intense and ambitious, Evan was calm, kind, and stable. He didn't have a dazzling career or a meticulously mapped-out 5-year plan. Instead, he had a serene confidence and a genuine interest in getting to know me for who I really was. At first, I was hesitant to let him into my life. My experience with Greg had left me wary of relationships, especially those that could lead to marriage or, God forbid, another round on the emotional roller coaster that was trying to start a family. But Evan was patient. He didn't pressure me to open up or rush anything. Slowly, I found myself letting my guard down. Evan and I started spending more time together. Dinners at cozy restaurants, walks, and quiet nights, watching movies on his couch. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years, and his gentle support helped me see that I was still capable of loving and being loved. About 4 months into our relationship, something unexpected happened. I started feeling sick, nauseous, fatigued, and strangely averse to my morning coffee. At first, I thought it was just stress or maybe the flu. But when the symptoms persisted, I decided to see my doctor. Sitting in the sterile examination room, I described my symptoms to the doctor, half hoping he would attribute them to a virus or changes in my diet. Instead, he suggested a pregnancy test. I laughed nervously and told him that was impossible. After years of unsuccessful fertility treatments, I had accepted that pregnancy was not in the cards for me. But the test was positive. I looked at the doctor in disbelief, expecting him to tell me it was a mistake. When he didn't, I burst into tears, not just out of shock, but out of a deep and overwhelming feeling of joy. After everything I had been through, I was finally going to have the baby I had dreamed of for so long. Evan was as surprised as I was when I broke the news. He wrapped his arms around me, a huge smile spreading across his face, and told me that this was the best surprise he could have imagined. His enthusiasm was contagious, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel hope. A follow-up appointment with my doctor confirmed that the pregnancy was healthy and progressing normally. It was during that visit that I asked a question that had been bothering me since the positive result. How was this possible when years of fertility treatments with Greg had failed? The doctor explained that sometimes stress and emotional strain could affect fertility, but then asked if Greg had ever been thoroughly examined. I admitted that he had always resisted, insisting that the problem wasn't on his side. She nodded thoughtfully and said that it wasn't unusual for couples to focus solely on the woman's fertility, even when male factors could play an important role. The conversation lingered in my mind as I left the office. Could it be that Greg was the one with fertility problems all along? The possibility made my stomach churn. During our marriage, he had been so quick to blame me, so sure that I was at fault. I had spent years feeling flawed because of his words, only to discover now that the problem might never have been mine at all. Even so, I chose to focus on the present. Evan and I immersed ourselves in the preparations for the baby, turning his spare room into a nursery and reading books about parenting together. My parents and close friends were delighted when I shared the news, and their joy only added to my own. I had spoken to Evan, and regardless of how new our relationship was, I was determined to go ahead with this pregnancy. He wouldn't have to take on any responsibility in the future if he decided to leave now, but if he wanted to be with me, or the baby, or both of us, he could be honest about his feelings. After waiting for so long, this pregnancy was a miracle for me. As the weeks went by, the memory of Greg lingered in the back of my mind. Part of me wanted to contact him and tell him about the pregnancy and the doctor's comments about male infertility. Not to make him feel bad, but to give him the opportunity to reflect on his actions and perhaps look for answers for himself. But another part of me wanted to keep this chapter of my life completely separate from him. In the end, I decided not to tell him. This pregnancy was my miracle, my new beginning, and I didn't want anything or anyone to overshadow it. With each passing day, my excitement grew. The baby's first kicks were like little reminders of how far I had come and how much I had overcome. Even so, I couldn't help wondering if Greg would eventually find out about the pregnancy through mutual friends or social media. And if he did, how would he react? Would he feel remorse for the way he had treated me? Or would he still be the same arrogant, self-centered man who had walked away when the going got tough? For now, I chose not to think about it. My focus was on the future, on the baby growing inside me, on the new life I was building with Evan, and on the happiness that had finally found its way back into my life. Update 1. The first indication that Greg had heard about my pregnancy came through a mutual friend. One night, while checking my messages, I noticed one from Sarah, a former colleague of Greg's with whom I had kept in touch. She congratulated me on the pregnancy, adding that Greg had contacted her, apparently looking for information about my new life. My stomach tightened. It wasn't entirely surprising, but I had hoped to keep him as far away as possible from this new chapter of my life. A week later, my phone rang. It was Greg. I answered out of curiosity. His tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as he asked if the rumors were true. Was I really pregnant? I calmly told him that I didn't see how it was any of his business. But yes, I was expecting. There was a long pause, and then he exploded, accusing me of lying during our marriage. He said that I should have known all along that there was nothing wrong with my fertility, and that I had wasted years of his life and thousands of dollars on unnecessary treatments. His voice dripped with anger and disbelief as he insisted that I explain myself. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep my composure. I reminded him that I had undergone tests during our marriage, and that every doctor we had seen had focused on me because he had always refused to have tests. I added that my current pregnancy was not proof of anything other than the fact that circumstances had changed, and that maybe it was time for him to take a closer look at his own health instead of jumping to conclusions. Greg scoffed, accusing me of avoiding the issue. He said I had tricked him into believing that I was the problem, and that I owed him answers. I told him I had nothing more to say and ended the call. Update 2. I thought that would be the end of it, but I should have known better. A few weeks later, Greg called again, this time sounding calmer. He admitted that he had gone to a doctor and had undergone tests for the first time. The results, he said, confirmed that he had a low sperm count and motility problems, factors that would have made conception almost impossible without advanced intervention. Hearing him admit it out loud should have been a relief, but instead it stirred up a mixture of emotions. I struggled against the years I had spent blaming myself, the countless nights I had cried alone, and the way his impatience and anger had eroded my trust. It was hard not to feel a surge of resentment, knowing that all of this could have been avoided if he had only been willing to consider the possibility that he wasn't perfect. But Greg didn't call to apologize. Instead, he doubled down on his anger, telling me that I owed him all the money we had spent on fertility treatments during our marriage. He argued that since the problem had been his all along, the money had been wasted and I was responsible for reimbursing him. I was stunned. It was as if I couldn't see the irony of the situation. Not only had he refused to consider his own role in our infertility problems, but now he was trying to shift the blame and the financial burden onto me. I told him that the treatments were a joint decision, taken during our marriage when we both believed they were necessary. I reminded him that we had shared the emotional and financial costs, just as we had shared the hope of starting a family. If he now saw those treatments as a waste, that was his business, not mine. Greg didn't take my refusal well. He accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, claiming that he had sacrificed so much for me during our marriage, and that now I was reaping the rewards without him. He even hinted that he might take legal action if I didn't repay the $50,000 he claimed to have spent on his own. The conversation left me shaken, but I refused to let his threats overshadow my happiness. I talked to Evan about it that night, and he was as understanding as ever. He reminded me that Greg's behavior was a reflection of his own insecurities and failures, not mine. Even so, I couldn't help feeling a nagging sense of frustration. Greg's inability to take responsibility for his actions had been a recurring theme in our marriage, and now he seemed determined to carry that pattern into our post-divorce lives. Update 3. As you all know, Greg's harassment started small, with a few emails and text messages repeating the same demand, that I repay the $50,000 he claimed I owed him for fertility treatments during our marriage. He insisted that, as the problem was not mine, I should take financial responsibility for what he now considered a waste of time and money. At first, I ignored it, hoping he would lose steam and move on. But Greg was not the kind of man who let things go easily. Within days, his tone had shifted from accusatory to downright terrifying. He sent messages warning that if I didn't reimburse him, he would take me to court. He claimed he had receipts and proof of every dollar spent, and he was prepared to expose me as a liar who had taken advantage of him. The threats disturbed me more than I wanted to admit, even though I knew his claims were baseless. The idea of a legal battle while I was preparing for a baby felt overwhelming. I needed clarity and protection, so I contacted my lawyer Helen to ask for advice. Helen listened patiently as I explained the situation. Her calm demeanor was a stark contrast to my growing anxiety. She assured me that Greg didn't have a leg to stand on. Fertility treatments, she explained, were a shared marital expense. It didn't matter who was ultimately responsible for the infertility. The decisions we made as a couple during our marriage were just that, joint decisions. Helen also pointed out that Greg's threats bordered on harassment. She advised me to start documenting everything, every text, email, voicemail, and social media message he sent. If it continued to escalate, she said, we could consider sending a formal cease and desist letter. Her words were a relief, but they also rekindled a feeling of anger. For years, I had allowed Greg to control the narrative of our relationship, to make me feel small and responsible for every problem we faced. This time, I wasn't going to let him bully me into submission. The next time Greg sent me an email, attaching screenshots of clinic and doctor receipts, I forwarded it directly to Helen. She drafted a firm reply, reminding him that I was under no obligation to reimburse him for shared marital expenses and warning him to cease contact immediately, unless it was through legal channels. Greg, of course, did not take kindly to the warning. His emails became more erratic, accusing me of manipulating the system and threatening to ruin me if I didn't comply. He even hinted that he might show up at my house to discuss things in person, which sent a chill down my spine. I spoke to Evan about everything that was happening, and his support was unwavering. He told me that Greg's behavior was nothing more than the tantrum of a man who couldn't accept his own failures. Evan also suggested that we invest in a home security system, in case Greg decided to make good on his threat to show up unannounced. With Helen's help, I filed a police report to document the harassment, and although it didn't lead to immediate action, having an official record of Greg's behavior gave me a sense of security. I also blocked his number and set up filters on my email to make sure his messages went straight to a folder I rarely checked. Despite all this, Greg found new ways to escalate. He started contacting mutual friends and even some of my family, spinning a sad tale about how I had conned him out of tens of thousands of dollars. He painted himself as the victim of a cunning ex-wife who had deliberately lied about her fertility to get money out of him. It was outrageous to hear the lies he was spreading, but I reminded myself that the people who mattered, the ones who really knew me, wouldn't believe his nonsense. And sure enough, many of the friends he tried to involve contacted me directly, offering their support and expressing disbelief at Greg's antics. One particularly infuriating moment came when my cousin Janet called to tell me that Greg had turned up at a family barbecue she was organizing, uninvited, and had spent the evening ranting about how I had destroyed his life. Janet, who had never liked Greg to begin with, quickly asked him to leave and assured me that no one in the family was taking him seriously. Even so, the constant drama took its toll. I hated the idea of Greg's negativity hanging over my pregnancy, a time that should have been full of joy. Evan reminded me to focus on the positive, to remember that Greg's despair was a sign that I had regained control of my life. Helen eventually sent Greg a cease and desist letter, warning him that any further attempts to contact me or involve third parties would result in legal action. She also reminded him that stalking was a serious crime and that his behavior could have consequences far beyond what he intended. The letter seemed to work, at least temporarily. For a few weeks there was blissful silence. No emails, no phone calls, no dramatic stories from mutual friends. I began to breathe a little easier, concentrating on preparing for the baby and enjoying the peace that had been lacking for so long. But Greg didn't want to fall silent. Just when I was starting to think the storm had passed, he found a new angle. He sent a letter, this time through his own lawyer, stating that he was considering filing a lawsuit for emotional distress caused by my alleged cheating during our marriage. Helen laughed when she read the letter, calling it a desperate attempt to scare me into compliance. She assured me that the claim had no legal merit and advised me to continue to ignore Greg's antics unless he actually proceeded with a court filing, which she doubted he would. Sure enough, the threat turned out to be empty. Greg had neither the resources nor the evidence to back up his claims, and after a few more weeks of silence, it became clear that he had finally given up, or at least retreated to lick his wounds. The experience was exhausting, but it also reinforced something I had learned over the last year. I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. Greg's attempts to intimidate and manipulate me had failed, because I refused to let him dictate my life any longer. Update 4. Questions started coming in soon after my last update, and I was overwhelmed by the response. Many of you were curious about the logistics of what had happened since the divorce, especially regarding the house I had lived in with Greg. Some asked who got the house after the separation. Others wondered where Evan and I were now. To clarify this first, the house I had lived in with Greg wasn't really ours to claim. It belonged to his mother, my ex-mother-in-law. Greg and I had lived there as part of a long-standing arrangement, where his mother allowed us to stay in the house rent-free as long as we took care of the maintenance and treated it as our own. It was never officially in either of our names. When Greg and I split up, it wasn't exactly to either of us. Greg tried to claim the house as his later on, but he was technically a tenant, not the owner. His mother, understandably, wanted to avoid the drama and just sold the place. It wasn't something I was going to fight for, mainly because I knew I had no legal right to it. And emotionally, I was ready to get away from anything that reminded me of my failed marriage. As for where Evan and I live now, we're staying at Evan's place. It's a cozy place in a quiet neighborhood, and it feels like a fresh start in every way. Evan had been living there for a while before we met, and it's actually one of the reasons I felt so comfortable and secure moving in with him so quickly. He wasn't just offering me a place to stay, he was offering me the security and stability I had longed for so long. Many of you were curious about how Greg knew where I was living now, especially given that I had gone to great lengths to block his contact. Well, it turns out that mutual friends and family members had shared that information with him. It wasn't like I was broadcasting my new address, but some people who didn't see Greg's actions as unreasonable, decided to pass on that information. It wasn't a big surprise, but it still hurt to know that my privacy had been invaded by people who should have known better. One of the most unexpected parts of this whole situation came when my father contacted me. We hadn't spoken much in the years leading up to the divorce, and after everything that happened with Greg, I expected him to be a source of comfort. But when he found out about Evan and me, he started to express concerns. Dad wasn't one for beating around the bush. He asked directly if I was sure about this relationship with Evan, especially with the pregnancy and everything that had happened with Greg. He told me he didn't want me to rush into something just because I was desperate for a family. I understood the concern, but at that moment, I wasn't going to let his worries influence my decisions. I told him I wasn't desperate for a family, I was building one. A healthy and supportive family with Evan, who cared for me in a way that Greg never had. I wasn't rushing into anything. I was embracing the new chapter in my life, and finally doing it on my own terms. I assured him that I knew what I was doing. I wasn't trying to fill any void with Evan. This wasn't about desperation. It was about real love and real support. I could feel the concern in his tone, but I also knew that I had to stand my ground. This was my life, and I wasn't going to let anyone dictate my choices anymore. Dad didn't respond immediately. After a long pause, he told me he just didn't want to see me get hurt again. He added that he didn't trust people like Evan, not right away. He knew where I was coming from. I had seen how Greg treated me, and I had witnessed the emotional roller coaster of our marriage, but I wasn't going to let that cloud my judgment about Evan. I told him I appreciated his concern, but that I had to live my own life. I had learned from the past and I wasn't about to make the same mistakes again. My father didn't say much after that, but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. He still had his doubts, and I knew it would take time for him to adjust, but I also knew that this was my life and I had to live it on my terms, not on his. My mother, on the other hand, was a little more understanding. She had been a pillar of strength for me during the divorce and knew how difficult the years with Greg had been. When I told her about Evan, she was happy for me, but she still expressed some concern about the timing of everything. She told me she just didn't want me to feel too overwhelmed by everything at once. A pregnancy, a new relationship, it was a lot, especially so soon after everything with Greg. I could understand where she was coming from. The timing wasn't ideal, but I wasn't overwhelmed. I was excited. I told her I wasn't rushing into anything. I had given this decision a lot of thought. I wasn't doing this alone. Evan was there for me, and we were in this together. I told her we had discussed it beforehand. She didn't push the issue any further, although I could tell she was still cautious. It was just her way of looking out for me, as always. I didn't mind. It meant she cared. Despite the concern of both my father and my mother, I couldn't help feeling that I was on the right track. Yes, everything had changed in the blink of an eye, and yes, the circumstances were far from ideal, but this was my new beginning,